So how do we understand anxiety disorders? I mean, how do we explain where they come from? Or why is it that some people experience anxiety and others experience depression, for example? So how do we understand that? Well, for example, the learning perspective, which we've been learning and you've been studying all along, really. The learning perspective looks at anxiety as a function of fear conditioning. Specifically, let me just say this. Fear conditioning is one component part, which is really classical conditioning. It's the chaining of a neutral stimulus with a certain emotion, naturally occurring emotion. We have stimulus generalization, so it might, somebody who's dog phobic might have gotten bitten by, and this is a ridiculous example and I use it because of that, might have gotten bitten by a chihuahua, but is now afraid of St. Bernards. So that's generalization, stimulus generalization. I'll just put generalize. And then also reinforcement of fearful behavior. So we've got reinforcement. And we also have, last but not least in this particular perspective, is observational learning. And the learning perspective would suggest that people that develop anxiety disorders are conditioned by an initial instance. Now think of little Albert, who was conditioned to be afraid of rabbits. Nice, fuzzy little rabbits. Don't hurt anybody, right? But he was reinforced, or he was conditioned by a loud sound, which was connected then to a warm, fuzzy little rabbit that looked relatively fun to play with. So the learning perspective is actually the one. We have something called evidence-based treatments. And the learning perspective is really, it falls in the category of behavioral therapy, is the treatment of choice for most anxiety disorders because of the effectiveness with which it desensitizes people to the conditioning that they've experienced. So let me write this out. This is evidence-based treatment, and we'll talk a little bit about this next time, but I'll throw it in here so that you get a perspective of just how important behavior and learning principles are. The second one is the biological perspective, which is pictured down below. Biological perspective. And this explains why we learn some fears more readily and why some individuals are more vulnerable. It's the areas in the brain that are the most sensitized to fear itself. Essentially, it emphasizes, this does, evolutionary perspectives. In other words, what's been learned over time and passed between or amongst species for feared objects. It is also involves and connects up the genetic component of fear and learning, for that matter. We've gotten fairly clear about reactivity even at the neural basis, which leads us to the last one, and that's the neural basis of not only learning but also the development of fear and anxiety. So each one of those are part of the biological perspective. And the other one, which I don't think your book spends very much time on, is something that I would put in as a cognitive perspective. And I think that this particular one really includes all of them in some respects, maybe not as primary, but the cognitive perspective really says that how we frame our reality, has everything to do with how we react, which leads to reactions. So it's not one or the other. And remember, when we were talking about emotions, that kind of triangle model where you have the event and you have an appraisal of it, which is the cognitive component to it. And that appraisal leads to the reaction. You also have the event, and there is a biological or physiological response to it. And then from that, you end up having the reaction. And if you recall from emotions, we actually are capturing both of these in here, and that really is part of anxiety disorders, is that we tend to underestimate the power of our beliefs in anxiety, and that is usually what the more cognitive perspective has to offer us when we talk about treating and understanding an anxiety disorder. We have a high degree of self-talk, if you will, that, like I said, frames the world for us, and that is part of more of a cognitive perspective rather than a pure learning perspective, but also the biological perspective as well. And cognitive, I would suggest to you, and you might even put in cognitive, and I'll try to squeeze it in down here, is behavioral. You actually have a more comprehensive model when you include both of these, really. And so it is oftentimes referred to as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and this tends to have a high degree of efficacy when it comes to treating anxiety.